Hi, and welcome to my FlossTube video. This is Jean Varish, and I am so glad that you're here with me today. For a while there, I didn't think we were even going to have this episode because I was having difficulty with my video playback, but I got it fixed, and so I have learned yet one more time that when something goes wrong, the first thing to do is turn the device off and back on again and see if that fixes the problem. So here we are. This has been just a really strange week here in North Carolina. I woke up this morning and it was like 48 degrees Fahrenheit. For those of you who are more familiar with Celsius, that's like 7 degrees, which if you live in a really northern climate, you're probably saying, so what's the problem? But for middle of May in North Carolina, that's a really cold morning. So I actually had to turn the fireplace on. We have gas logs, so that's pretty easy. And I'm glad we hadn't turned the pilot light off yet, so I could just flip that switch and snuggle down and do some stitching and just enjoy a good hunk of time today doing that. So last week we talked about the use of what we call a medial S. We're familiar with the rounded S, and the medial S is the one that looks like a letter F, but is not. It's not related to the letter F at all. And so if you missed that video, you might want to go back and watch it. That's episode 41. But this week, I want to talk about the fact that many antique samplers are missing the letter J. And in fact, one of my early sampler reproductions, both early in my career and early date-wise, this is Katie Bemis, and Katie stitched her sampler in 1787, and she was just 11 years old when she stitched it. And this one does not have the letter J in it. Katie's currently out of print, but getting it dusted off for this video, I think it's time for me to rechart it and get it ready to republish it. So you can look for that maybe in the next couple of months. So why is the letter J missing? And I, in preparation for this, just to double check some of the dates of some of the things I'm going to be telling you about, I came across a couple blog posts from people who say things like, it's a stitching mistake, these are schoolgirl samplers, so don't expect them all to be literate. Some of them are going to just miss a letter, and that just isn't the case. Here's the deal with the letter J as it relates to the English language. First of all, the letter J was originally a swash. It was it wasn't even the letter J. It was the letter I. And when it was used as the last letter in a word, or if it was the last numeral in writing out a Roman numeral, then they used this thing called a swash, which looks like the letter J. So it's just a little hook on the letter I. So that's the origin of the J as it relates to the I. So it wasn't until like, not the middle of the 1500s, but kind of like 1525 or so, that the J was introduced as its own letter in Italy. And I can't comment as far as how commonly it became used at that point, but and of course that goes back to the Roman alphabet. In the Roman alphabet, there is no letter J. Okay, so let's just get that out there to start with. So somewhere like in the early 1500s, certainly by 1550, the letter J started being used in Italy. From there, it moved to France, and from there, it moved to England. So it's a letter that came late to the English alphabet. And when you think about it, start trying to think of words that begin with the letter J that are truly English words, that derive from any one of the early English languages, and it's hard to find one. The letter J words that we're familiar with might be Chinese. They might have their origins in India and in other cultures throughout the world. But try finding one that's an old English word that begins with the letter J. Not counting proper nouns, not counting names like John, for example, or Jean. Jean, actually, I believe, was originally Ian, starting with the letter I, of course. But at any rate, I'm getting off topic here. Okay, so today the J is actually the fourth least used letter in the English language. The only letters that are used less are the X, the Z, and the Q. So that gives you an idea of how little used the letter J is in our native language. So let's kind of fast forward. Well, we're still going backwards, but fast forwarding from the 1500s to 1755, and Samuel Johnson publishes the first English dictionary. Let me correct myself, because I can't say for certain that it was the first one, but it was the first one that was widely used. So 1555, Samuel Johnson publishes a dictionary of the English language. And it is going to be the #1 reference for the English language until the Oxford English Dictionary is introduced, like, I don't know, 150, 175 years later. So I'm going to share some screenshots with you just to give you an idea of how the I and the J were integrated. In Samuel Johnson's dictionary, the IJ entry is a single letter entry. So you have things like ice following the word J. You have jealous following idle. You have ivory following junction. When Johnson alphabetized these words, he did not distinguish between the I and the J, and he used that second letter to determine the alphabetical order. So again, I just use that as an illustration that these schoolgirls were not making a mistake. It was very common usage for the I and the J to just be integrated as one letter. So that just gives you another little glimpse into the history of samplers, and the older the sampler, the less likely it's going to have a J in it. Now, speaking of samplers, I have been working on the Great Parks sampler, which I am now calling the Bison and the Elk. So this is what I have stitched so far in the Bison and the Elk, and I've been introducing the colors slowly but surely, and this is what I have so far. A nice golden yellow. I'm going to have a turquoise and a kind of robin's egg blue, some nice forest greens, purple of course, and then some nice kind of rosy clay colors. I started with a much wider palette, and I've been slowly but surely introducing one color at a time. That's probably my biggest challenge as a designer, is to get the colors right in terms of how they relate to each other. And one of the challenges is that when you look at a whole skein, you're looking at a very intense hunk of color. And then when you start looking at like a herringbone row that's done with 2 strands, it's going to not be as intense as like that whole skein. And the same thing, like, even though this is all cross stitch up here, this little yellow checkerboard row, but you get a different sense of the color when you're looking at individual stitches as opposed to a whole hunk of color. So these are some of the things that that I need to check as I'm going along and designing. And one of the reasons, I mentioned this last week or maybe the week before, one of the reasons why I like to stitch my own samples or at least stitch them far enough that I can test out the colors. And now that I've gotten this far, I'm going to concentrate on this right-hand side, because what I really want to do is get to where I can start stitching that bison, so that I can test the colors, where I'm using the shape, the outline shape of a bison, and superimposing one of the designs that comes from our American Southwest. So that's kind of where I am with this. Now, this is a sampler that I will be publishing for widespread use. To start with, it's going to be the commemorative sampler for what we're dubbing the Great Parks trip. And this one is in September. And I keep saying I'm so excited about this. I'm sure anybody who has travel plans cannot wait to dust off the suitcase and get ready to go again. And I'm just hoping that our country continues to progress in terms of improving with COVID-19, and that travel is going to continue to look like a safe bet for this fall. This trip is actually going to begin in Arizona. We're going to visit the absolutely amazing Attic Needlework shop in Mesa, and then have some time to explore Scottsdale area as well. And then from there, we're taking the Verde Canyon Rail through Arizona's one of their magnificent canyons. We're also going to be taking the historic Grand Canyon Railway through, of course, the Grand Canyon. And we're going to see Lake Powell. We're going to go to Zion National Park. There's Capitol Reef National Park on the agenda, Moab, Canyonlands National Park, and Arches National Park. And then we end actually in Grand Junction, Colorado, which for me is a real treat because I haven't seen my daughter Catherine and her husband since Christmas a year ago, and they live in Colorado. So I'm going to get to spend a week or so with them. And I'm going to be teaching at a stitching shop in Denver during that break. Then that is almost immediately followed by the Redwoods and wine trip. Both of these trips are being organized and promoted by RGE Travels, and I'm really looking forward to working with John and Ray. So I get to come as the talent. I get to come and just really relax and enjoy myself. I'm not the organizer. I'm not going to be the one in charge. So I'm doubly, triply, quadruply excited about this. So I'm actually going to start. The trip officially starts in San Francisco, but I'm going to start in Denver, and you are invited to come along with me. I'm going to take that overnight train, the Zephyr, the California Zephyr overnight train from Denver to San Francisco. So I'm hoping that we're going to not miss too much of the magnificent landscape that we will be traveling through, because it'll be nighttime part of that time. But then we will arrive in San Francisco, and we will join everybody else who's going on the trip and do some sightseeing in San Francisco. And we're going to go over to Alameda and go to Needle in a Haystack, which is a fantastic shop as well. And then we have things like, there's the Redwood Steam Train, which is a vintage narrow gauge train railway that we will take up to the summit of Bear Mountain. And we're going to go to Yosemite. And there's another trail journey I think it's called the Sugar Pine Railroad, that goes through the Sierra National Forest. We're also going to go to Railtown State Historic Park, which I'm beginning to read up on. And then we go to Sonoma and Napa and have yet one more train journey, this one being a 36-mile train journey that will take us from Napa to St. Helena and back. And that will be a wine tasting tour as well. So we end up back in San Francisco. And again, I feel like, like you, for a year and a half, I haven't traveled at all. and I am dusting off all my travel gear and really getting ready for these 2 really great trips. So now the Redwoods and Wine tour, we haven't even started well, actually today, that's right, it's early morning right now while I'm putting this all together, but by the time you're watching this, registration will be open on May 15th for the Redwoods and Wine tour, and space is limited to, I think, 40 people. Now for the Great Parks trip, we've been taking registrations for that one for a while, and Ray and John tell me there's just a couple spots left open for that. Now, both of these trips, although I'm excited about the stitching aspect of this as well as the scenery, I do want to make sure that you know that both of these trips are fantastic journeys for somebody who's not necessarily a stitcher. So if you love to stitch and your favorite travel buddy is not a stitcher, this is an opportunity to combine both things and take your love of travel and your enjoyment of traveling with this special someone and bring them along, and we will also do some stitching. So I don't want anybody to have the impression that it's all going to be about stitching, because that's just not the case. And I will also say that I know that for the Great Parks trip, which, like I said, we've been taking registrations for the last month or so, we already have quite a few couples on that trip. And I have a feeling for the Redwoods and Wine tour, we're going to have couples as well. And actually, it's Redwoods, Rails, and Wine, because as I described to you, we're going to be doing a lot of train stuff as we're going along. So anyway, so I'm really excited about all that stuff. This week, a couple of really good questions came in. One from Holly, and she simply said, when do you remove the grid when you do gridding? Because last week I showed a small part. Oh, I need to show you this sampler too. Yeah, I need to show you this progress. So this is a good time to talk about this particular question. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around all over the place. On this sampler, I had put in a grid area. I got about this far. I did this part, and I kept making mistakes. And so finally, when I got here, I thought, you know what? I'm just gonna grid this area. I'm not gonna grid the whole sampler. I don't really need to, but I'm gonna grid this area and minimize my mistakes. And it really helped. So the question I got from Holly was, so when do you remove those grid lines? Now, I will tell you that in the world of gridding, I am definitely in the minority, because I just pick up ends, rather long ends of leftover floss, and I rethread my needle with it, just a single strand, and I create my grid or my basting line. So I'm using floss, which means that it can get pierced by my needle as I'm stitching around it or over it. Most people who do serious gridding use some threads that cannot be pierced by your needle. My daughter uses a Redline, and I forgot to grab it before I came down here where I do my video. So I will put it in the comments as far as what she uses. It may have started out live as fishing line. I don't know whether or not it did or not, but this is something that somebody produces for gridding, and she really likes it. And she often, after she pulls it out, she will save it and reuse it. So I know it's very durable. I am getting done. I realize I haven't answered Holly's question yet. I am getting there. And then a lot of people use something that's produced by Sulky. And again, I'm going to have to just check my notes, and we'll put it in the episode description as far as what some other people have recommended. I have not used it myself, so I can't speak to it from my own experience, but I see people referring to using it all the time. I need to answer Holly's question, and then I want to come back to this question of what to use for gridding. So for Holly, I take out my grid lines and my basting lines as I get to them. Again, mainly because I'm using floss, and floss very easily is pierced by my stitching. If I don't remove it just before I get to the area, then just as soon as I am past it, I am getting rid of it. If you're using something that cannot be penetrated by your tapestry needle, then, fine, just, pull it out when you are finished with that area. This is what I need to say about grid lines and basting with anything other than a type of thread. And specifically, I will tell you, pencils and pens are two things I would never use on my needlework, on this type of needlework. I'm not talking about surface embroidery, and there are certainly some occasions when marking pens are required. I don't see the great advantage of them over gridding with some sort of thread. And I think that the dangers that are associated with them are too great to be worth the risk. And the dangers are that the lines won't come out. Now, some of the pens and pencils are supposed to disappear with water, and some of them are supposed to disappear with heat. So the first challenge is that the lines don't always disappear as they are supposed to. An equal danger, but one that you would not be aware of for some time, is sometimes they do disappear initially and then they come back weeks or months or even years later. Now, why do these companies promote them as being removable, disappearing ink when they don't always work? Well, again, that comes back to science, and that is that the water in your house is probably not going to be the same as the water in my house. And it may not be the same as the water that was used in the laboratory where these things were tested. So that's one of the things. The other problem comes with, I said at the beginning of this episode that we have this cold snap right now. But as we are getting into the warm weather, one of the other things that happens is we needleworkers, when travel starts being, possible, we carry our needlework with us. And even during COVID, when we can't necessarily travel for pleasure, you may take needlework with you, say, to a doctor's appointment. Or you take it with you to work and to work on it during your lunch hour or whatever. And when your needlework is left in the car for any length of time in the warm weather, then it's being exposed to heat. And that can have an influence on whether or not those lines come out. So again, it's, to me, it's the risk-benefit ratio. I don't see where the benefit of these pens and pencils outweigh the risks for this type of embroidery. Again, I'm not addressing surface embroidery and other types that really require some sort of an outline on your work. So I do want to make sure that you're clear about that. Yeah, so that's, so long answer to Holly's very, very quick question. When do I remove the grid? Now, while I have this piece out, let me talk to you a little bit about these other things that are going on with this design. Now, this is going to be Gracious Words, and the first, I'll be introducing this at Work of the Hands this year, and then later on, I will also produce it with teaching videos. This is the beginnings of what I thought would be the honeycomb that I want to build here. And this is using Valdani, and I was very excited about the Valdani that I got, and I shared that with you last week. Love the colors. It's a wonderful, wonderful thread. But for this, even though this is number 12 pearl cotton, I think it's just too heavy for this design. Now over here, I have basted in the blue lines of the honeycomb. And I did that mainly because I had some stitching time to do this row down here. And rather than just count the threads, I decided to lay in the honeycomb as I expected it to be, so that I could make sure I was getting this in exactly the right place. You know, last week I talked a little bit about how I probably wouldn't share a lot of this as I was going along, because it's going to be a much more complicated project than what I normally do. The stump work, which is also known as raised embroidery, adds a certain challenge to this. And a couple people wrote some encouraging notes and said, please do share your design process with us, even though you end up feeling like that what you're doing is a mistake. My design process includes the design elements as far as the lines, the shapes of the things. It's the color, and it's also the weight of the thread. And sometimes, as much as you see it in your mind's eye, as much as I've been stitching with number 12 pearl cotton for decades, and I know exactly what look you get from it, I didn't like how it lays on this fabric for this project. So, is that a mistake? Not necessarily. It's just knowing that what I'm trying to do with that design isn't working for this project. So that's why I am with gracious words. Last week, I also talked about stripping floss, and I got this great question from Deanna. She said, I have a question about the loop method of securing your floss and stripping your floss. At the point the one long piece has been doubled to pull through and secure your floss, do you then be sure the floss strands are parallel, or will they be naturally parallel? So unpacking Deanna's question, I think I understand what she is asking. Basically, as you strip your floss, and I take a single strand out to then double it and thread those two cut ends through the eye of my needle to start with the loop method, does the stripping automatically mean that those two strands are going to be parallel? And the answer to that is no. Stripping is an important step as far as making sure that you get good coverage when you're using multiple strands. Obviously, when you're using one strand, you are stripping simply by pulling that one strand out to be able to fold it in half and use it doubled up. I think that more than stripping the floss, the thing that helps in terms of keeping your two strands parallel to each other is dampening it. And again, I just use a sponge dampened with water. And that kind of irons out or straightens out the strand enough to keep them parallel. And as I'm stitching, I'm really watching my strands to make sure they're staying parallel to each other. Now, one of the things that you see all the time as far as tips or hints when people say about, keeping your strands parallel and not letting your threads get twisted up, people will talk about dropping your needle and letting it unspin itself to get the twist out. And although that helps, it doesn't get all the twist out. Try it sometime and really look at your two strands in your needle, and you will see that it does not necessarily get rid of all the places where your thread is twisted up. So that is a technique that I rarely use, because I just find that there are other things that I do that give me an easier way to keep those two threads parallel. So I've shown some of these before, and maybe it just bears repeating. So let me thread a needle and get a piece of fabric, and I'll show you what I do routinely. Okay, to start with, I used to use a 35mm film canister all the time, but people just don't use film like they used to. So this is actually by a company called Snap Lock, and it's intended to hold individual servings of like salad dressing and things like that in lunchbox. And I find them at Target, Walmart, whatever. And then I just cut sponges. And this actually is 2 layers. I couldn't find a sponge that's thick enough, so I just cut. Plus it's a little tapered, so I just cut 2 rounds of the sponge to put in there, and I just dampen it with water, and then I just run I'm just holding the strand down with my thumb, just enough pressure just to push it into the sponge a little bit to get it wet. And just to show you a comparison, so there's the one I just dampened. Here's another piece that I just pulled out of the same strand, the same hunk of floss. So you can see that this one is a little curlier, and every time you've got a place where you've got a little bend, that's a potential knot or tangle in your work. So that's one of the reasons that I always dampen my floss. Now I'm going to take that single strand of floss and basically fold it in half, bringing my two cut ends together. And that's what I'm going to thread in the eye of my needle. I'm going to use my needle threader here. Put the hook into the eye of the needle. Lay my two cut ends into the hook. Whoops. And then pull that back through the eye of the needle. Now I'm going to work in the Victorian method today. So I'm going to work over here from on the right hand side, and of course I'm working on linen, and I'm going to work over two, so each stitch is 2 threads high and 2 threads wide. Make sure when you're using the loop method that you're really bringing that, like that loop is very loose, so I want to tighten that up. Now, of course, my purpose today is to show you how I keep my 2 threads parallel. And you can see where, I mean, already they're just laying parallel to each other. And that's what I'm going to keep my eye on. While I'm stitching, I just want to make sure that I'm constantly making sure that my threads are parallel. Because if they're parallel here at the beginning, what's going to be the beginning of the stitch, then they're going to be parallel as I pull it through. Now, I'm kind of hoping it's going to twist up, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to show you how I'm going to untwist it. But so far, you can see they're just staying parallel to each other. Well, I'm still not accomplishing my goal of showing you how I untwist my threads, because you can see where they continue to just be parallel to each other. And that's not going to help me today. So I think I'm just going to have to mechanically twist this up so you can see what I'm talking about. So if you find that your threads are beginning to look like that, now I just twisted this twice, and you can see how many twists I ended up with in my stitching thread here. So when that happens, what I do is I straighten out my thread. Pardon me, my hand's in the way here. And there's 2 ways I deal with this. One is I just take my needle and put it between the 2 threads and run it up toward the needle. And as you do that, what you're doing is you're pushing the twist. See how I'm pushing the twist towards the needle's eye. And just untwist it. Now, theoretically, dropping your needle does the same thing. Except I find that when you drop your needle and you're basically using the weight of the needle to dangle and untwist it, you're not going to get all the twist out. So actually take the time to make sure that your threads are parallel to each other. Now you hear a lot of people talk about railroading, so let me see if I can show you railroading, which is another way of keeping your threads parallel to each other. When you do railroading, you're putting your needle between the two threads and inserting it to take your stitch. And what happens as you're doing that is the two threads will split and become parallel. So again, you put your needle between the threads, put your needle into the fabric, and as you pull it through, the threads will split, and every time they'll be parallel. Now that works, there's no doubt about it. But I just find that it's tedious, and I don't want to do that with every single stitch. So I just watch my thread and make sure that it stays parallel before I'm stitching with it. And if it doesn't, if it's not parallel, I straighten it out. So I'm basically, I guess in a way, what I'm doing is railroading the whole strand instead of just stitch by stitch. So this is what works for me, and it may work for you, it may not. I don't know. So just try it. And for those of you who are wondering, well, why is all this talk about keeping your two strands parallel to each other? Mainly it's to get good coverage. I could say that it makes your stitches prettier or neater, and I think that that's true. But particularly for people who find that they're not getting good coverage, I would really encourage you to first see if you can stitch with your two strands parallel to each other all the time and see if that doesn't give you better coverage. Because basically when the threads get twisted up, you often have one laying on top of each other, and so your eye is only seeing one strand instead of seeing the two. So that's that. Oh, and one other thing, pay attention to how you're stitching, because the other thing that can happen is that you don't realize that you're actually twisting your needle as you're stitching. And so if you kind of observe your own stitching, what you might find is that turning your needle a quarter of a turn as you take each stitch will prevent the turning that you don't mean to be taking. So if you're not actually turning your needle as you're stitching, forget what I just said. But if you are constantly starting with your two strands parallel, and after you take a half a dozen stitches or whatever, you notice that your threads are twisted up, you're probably twisting your needle as you're stitching. So just try to twist it in the opposite direction. So try it and see if that works. So missing J's and twisted threads and wine and trains and national parks and national forests, and that's a wrap for the day. So between now and next week, I hope that you stitch happy and stay safe. I'll see you then.